Black and Hispanic Americans are getting hit harder by inflation. Here's why. Many Americans are struggling to cope with higher prices for food, gas, housing and other essentials. But inflation has taken an even heavier toll on certain segments of the population. Let's take this time to subscribe this channel. Black and Hispanic Americans have been grappling with higher inflation rates than the national average since prices began surging in March 2021, according to a recent analysis from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. That's a shift from the pre-pandemic period, when Black and Hispanic Americans' inflation rates were at or slightly less than the national average. To determine the different inflation rates across demographic groups, New York Fed researchers used the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Survey to see how different racial and ethnic groups spend their money. They also factored in the price hikes for the various goods and services. For instance, Hispanic and Black Americans spend relatively more on transportation, including gas and used cars, both categories where prices have soared, and relatively less on entertainment and healthcare than white and Asian Americans do, the researchers found. Prices for most goods have surged in recent months due to pandemic-related supply chain constraints and the fallout from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Inflation is rising at its fastest pace in 40 years. The annual inflation rate for the major categories of consumption the New York Fed looked at was 9.2% in May, somewhat higher than the 8.6% reading for the Consumer Price Index that's typically used. However, adjusted for spending levels, the inflation rate for Hispanic Americans was roughly 0.6 percentage points higher than the overall rate researchers constructed. For Black Americans, it was about 0.2 percentage points higher. The rate for white Americans was very close to the overall rate the Fed constructed, while for Asian Americans, it was about 0.5 percentage points less. Notably, these spreads are more than twice as large as they were in 2019, though at that time Black and Hispanic Americans experienced slightly lower inflation than the national average and Asian Americans slightly more. The current inflation disparities among different demographic groups, however, are probably even larger than the analysis found, according to the researchers. Different groups likely pay different prices for the same items, and Black and Hispanic Americans likely face higher price growth. Employment is a different story. Black and Hispanic Americans have fared better when it comes to the jobs recovery after the pandemic-fueled economic downturn in the spring of 2020, an earlier New York Fed analysis found. That study focused on the employment-to-population ratio, which looks at the share of those working compared to the total number of people, for the 25 to 54 age bracket. When COVID-19 first upended the economy, Black and Hispanic Americans lost their jobs in greater numbers. This widened the employment rate gap to 6 percentage points or more for both groups, compared to the average American. By contrast, in February 2020, the spread was 4.4 percentage points for Black Americans and 2.3 percentage points for Hispanic Americans, the analysis found. But by May 2022, the gap for Black Americans was 3.3 percentage points, less than it was prior to the pandemic. For Hispanic Americans, the differential was 2.6 percentage points, just above its pre-pandemic spread. This contrasts with the job market recovery after the Great Recession. Employment rates took nearly a decade to return to their pre-downturn peak, both on average and for Black and Hispanic Americans. The researchers did not delve into why the employment rate gap narrowed so quickly in the current recovery. But the labor market has been very tight, making it easier for many people to find jobs. Who benefits from inflation? If you're constantly feeling like you're losing out during these inflationary times, you may wonder, does anyone actually benefit from inflation? On July 13, the Bureau of Labor Statistics released its Consumer Price Index and reported that from June 2021 to June 2022, prices on everything from food to fuel, and from dry cleaning to daycare, increased 9.1% on average. The CPI had notable increases for some time now, but it was yet another jump, and a larger one than economists were expecting. Inflation winners. 1. Borrowers with existing fixed-interest loans. Plenty of current and future borrowers won't benefit from inflation, but people who have already borrowed money and are paying back low-interest loans with fixed rates have something to be pleased about, observes Ahmed Rahman, Associate Professor of Economics at Lehigh University. 2. The energy industry. This won't surprise you if you own a car and fill up your tank on a regular basis. Due to a perfect storm of factors, energy prices have soared over the past year, says Eric Diton, President and Managing Director of the Wealth Alliance, a registered investment advisory firm in Melville, New York. Diton says a major factor in that perfect storm is climate change and the global response to it, but supply chain issues, labor shortages, the war in Ukraine, and COVID are all fueling higher energy prices. The result is that oil and gas producers are making record profits, and their stocks have been market leaders. 3. Electric vehicle manufacturers. After years of ho-hum sales, companies that make electric vehicles, or EVs, have a lot to celebrate. New car sales of electric vehicles in the second quarter of 2022 climbed 13% over the first quarter. EV sales hit a new record, one potentially driven by motorists wary of high gas prices. 4. The food industry. Generally speaking, inflation has been kind to the food industry. Not everyone, of course. Talk to any restaurant owner, and they'll tell you how they've been crushed by the pandemic and now inflation, given that customers were first afraid for their health if they dined out and now afraid for their pocketbooks. But food manufacturers, like a poultry processor? They're doing nicely. 5. Collectors. We'll end the inflation winners list on a fun note, especially if you've been thinking of selling the baseball cards you collected as a kid, or your coin collection. Inflation losers. 1. Anybody on a fixed salary or fixed income. If your salary or retirement income doesn't budge when inflation causes prices to go up, you may find your budget strained. Inflation is bad because it erodes the purchasing power of our income, says Ann York, professor of economics at Meredith College in Raleigh, North Carolina. Inflation is bad because it erodes the purchasing power of our income. York explains that if inflation has caused prices to climb by 5%, but your wages have only gone up 3%, you're not going to be able to buy as much as you used to. 2. Poor and low-income Americans. If you were living paycheck to paycheck before inflation went up, it has likely become even worse, since your paychecks probably buy less than they used to. 3. Renters. Generally, your monthly mortgage payment will remain the same, unless your property taxes go up, or you have an adjustable rate mortgage, ARM. But renters aren't so fortunate. As soon as that rental lease is up, landlords can typically raise your rent. The bottom line on inflation and rent, however, is that when your monthly payment goes up, and especially if you have a set monthly income, the extra revenue you pay to the landlord is going to come out of something else in your budget. And when everything else in your budget is also getting more expensive, that's when people start considering moving in with their parents or getting a roommate. A recent Pew Research Center report found that multi-generational living in a household with 2 or more adult generations, has been on the rise for a while, but the increase is fastest among adults ages 25 to 34. In 1971, 9% of these adults were living in multi-generational households, now that rate is up to 25%. As always, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe this channel.